Today, President Biden gears up to launch a re-election bid as soon as tomorrow. As new NBC News polling reveals, a majority of voters don't want either Biden or Trump to run again. Plus, can the Speaker of the House once again tame an unruly Republican caucus? Kevin McCarthy tries to ramp up pressure on the White House to begin talks over raising the debt limit as Congress faces a ticking economic time bomb. And the crisis deepening in Sudan. The U.S. military executes an emergency evacuation of embassy staff from Sudan's capital, as Secretary of State Blinken says more Americans are trying to leave but can't. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where we're expecting President Biden to officially announce he's seeking re-election as soon as tomorrow. NBC's White House team reporting that President Biden filmed portions of his re-election announcement video last weekend in Delaware. NBC News also reports Biden's campaign will be managed by Julie Chavez Rodriguez, a veteran of the Obama and Biden White Houses and granddaughter of labor leader Cesar Chavez. President Biden hinted at an upcoming announcement this afternoon at the White House.
Are you ready to run again, Mr. President?
And just moments ago, he told reporters at the White House once again to, quote, stay tuned. But our new NBC News poll shows a tough road ahead for the president's re-election bid. His presidential job approval is sitting at just 41%. That's the lowest we've measured for him since May. And only a quarter of Americans say he should run for a second term, compared to 70% who say he should not. More than half of Democrats think Biden should sit out the 2024 presidential race. We've never seen those sorts of numbers for an incumbent president in modern politics. Nearly half of those who say Biden shouldn't run cite his age as a major reason. President Biden would be 82 on Inauguration Day. But top allies are dismissing Biden's age as an issue. Here's Senator Dick Durbin with Chuck on Meet the Press.
He's with him time after time. His performance tells me he's up to the job and does it well. Let's concede the obvious, what his age is. But let's look at the obvious. He is an active president who is meeting the challenges of America every day.
But as we've heard Mr. Biden say dozens of times, don't judge me against the almighty, judge me against the alternative. He'll likely make that argument again. And a majority of respondents don't want to see the former president run again either in 2024. Neither Mr. Biden nor Mr. Trump have high favorability numbers, but the president does have a clear, if small, advantage. He also doesn't have any notable primary challengers. While Mr. Trump, of course, has challengers from within his own party, and critics like New Hampshire Republican Governor Chris Sununu sounding the alarm about his electability. Here's what he told Chuck yesterday.
We want a winner, right? Republicans want someone who can win in November of 24. Donald Trump is a loser. He has not just lost once. He lost us in our House seats in 2018. He lost everything in 20. We should have 54 U.S. senators right now. We don't because of his message. So Donald Trump is positioning himself to be a four-time loser in 2024. We need candidates that can win.
But electability questions aside, Mr. Trump remains the clear frontrunner for the GOP nomination. He got a 15-point lead over Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in our poll. No other candidate is even polling above double digits. And the Republican Party is largely rallying around him amid his ongoing legal struggles. Nearly 7 in 10 Republicans say investigations into Trump are politically motivated and warrant supporting the former president, while just 1 in 4 say it's important to nominate a candidate that does not have legal distractions. Joining me now to discuss all of this is Monica Alba with what we can expect from President Biden's re-election announcement. Also with us to break down our latest poll numbers, Steve Kornacki, of course, is at the big board. Monica, so I have to start with you. What are we expecting? You and I have been working our sources throughout the weekend. We're learning a little bit more about this announcement, which we are expecting could come as soon as tomorrow.
Yeah, we are kind of in that incremental phase, Kristen, where we're looking for every little sign to point to what we are expecting could happen as soon as tomorrow. And the reason we continue to couch this the way we have been is that anyone who knows Joe Biden or has covered him for years, as you have, knows that nothing is final with him until he really gives that ultimate green light and things move forward. And that sometimes at the 11th hour, with some kind of doubt or some kind of concern or for some reason to delay, that those things can happen. But setting that aside and that possibility. We are expecting that tomorrow really could be one of these days that the president does want to announce his re-election bid, because it's the 4-year anniversary of when he launched his successful 2020 campaign back in 2019. And he is someone who has always looked at that kind of symmetry and symbolism as something that he appreciates. Now, tomorrow, he's also scheduled in his official capacity as president to speak to a key union here in Washington, D.C. at their legislative conference, which is something that would mirror also what he did back in 2019 after announcing which one of his first stops was to go to a Pittsburgh Union Hall. So I think we can look at these parallels, and that's why aides point to this as a possibility on the calendar. It's something that they've debated for some weeks in terms of when the right time to announce is, when you're an incumbent president. But also there are these matters of fundraising, and once he does jump into the race, formally kicking some of those things off, he will be bringing dozens of donors to Washington later this week to talk about a bit of a strategy. And so that's also why we expect this likely will happen, but it will be in a more low-key fashion than your typical rollout, with a video that you did mention in the intro he has already taped some portions of, and that we'll likely see perhaps as early as tomorrow, Kristen.
We are staying tuned and staying close to our phones, Monica. There's no doubt about that. Steve Kornacki, let me turn to you. I mean, what can you tell us about the people who don't want President Biden and former President Trump, respectively, to run for president? Majority of Americans say they just don't want to see a rematch between these two.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of them. That's putting it mildly. I mean, you can see here among all voters here, Americans, Biden, it's basically barely a quarter who say they want to see him run for re-election. A full 70% who don't want to see him run for Trump. Barely a third want to see him run again. A big majority there, 60%, don't want to see him run again. Take a look at this. Break it down by party. What you're seeing here are the percent in each for each candidate who don't want to see them running. And you had mentioned this. It is actually a majority of Democrats. When you ask this question, 51% of Democrats say they don't want to see Biden running. There's a lot of Republicans who don't want to see Trump running, but the number for Trump in his own party is lower than the number is for Biden in his own party. You see 51%, 32%. There also is a difference among independents. It's basically 3 out of 4 independents who say they don't want to see Biden running again, and it's just under 60% who don't want to see Trump running. So there are big majorities who don't want to see either one of them running. The numbers are a little bit higher there for Biden, although, and we can get into this, that doesn't necessarily indicate that this is Biden losing ground to Trump if it were to come to a head-to-head matchup between them.
Yeah, the numbers are just stunning. Monica, let me go back to you and get you to weigh in on this, because obviously one of the big concerns has to do with the president's age. What is the White House saying? What is their strategy to counter some of these tough numbers that Steve is just laying out for us?
Yeah, age certainly a top concern in that NBC News poll that we have just been diving into. And the White House and even the president, when he's asked about this, has what they call a very simple response, which is just watch him. Watch the president. Look at the hours he clocks. Look at the trips and the travel that he does. Yes, he is 80 years old, something that he cannot change, that no one can alter. But the fact that they say he keeps as busy a schedule as he does while governing and accomplishing major legislative achievements, they say that should show you that he is up to the job, which is something you heard echoed from his Democratic allies over the weekend, who were also asked about this and were quick to dismiss any of this potential criticism. But I think you also really have to look at this as something that the White House will have to acknowledge head on. The fact that he is the oldest president ever to serve in history, the fact that he would be 82 if he were elected to another term, and 86 at the end of that. That is just a reality that means that for the Democratic Party, there's also just major questions about the next generation. And is that someone like Vice President Kamala Harris automatically, or are there others in the conversation? That is something that is certainly confronted here and can't be ignored when you do talk about the president's age, as he continues to do and hold a very, very busy schedule, they'd say.
You're no doubt about that, Monica. I think we're going to see a lot of focus on the vice president this election cycle from both Democrats and Republicans. Steve, let me go back to you and talk about the broader Republican field, because it's starting to take shape. We're obviously still waiting to hear from some potential candidates. Ron DeSantis, for example, hasn't announced that he's running officially yet, but all signs are pointing to him getting into the race. Dig into those numbers for us. Where does the 2024 field stand right now?
Yeah, so I mean, here you could see you got Trump, the announced candidate, running at 46% in our poll, and now you've got some announced, some prospective. As you say, DeSantis not announced yet, but DeSantis, the only one here, including Trump's former vice president, who's really getting meaningful traction in polling with Donald Trump. There have been a number of national polls that have come out over the last couple months here. This is actually one of the better ones recently for DeSantis versus Trump. He's trailed Trump basically in all of them, but some have had the margin 20, 30 points. This one puts it at 15 points. One factor that may be going on here is you had the legal action taken against Donald Trump in New York City. Now it's been several weeks since that happened. Did Trump get a bump in some of the earlier polls that came out a week or two ago that might be receding a bit that we're seeing here? Because it was interesting. We have a question in this poll where we asked Republican voters basically, how do you view these investigations, these legal investigations into Trump? Do you view it from the standpoint of, hey, it's too much of a distraction, should nominate someone else who can focus on just beating Biden? Not even 30% say yes to that. When you ask them no, we ask them, are these investigations partisan, motivated to stop Trump, and therefore we should rally around Trump? Close to 70% say yes to that. So I think that's a number, that's a question worth keeping in mind as this year plays out, because the likelihood is you'll continue to have these sort of eruptions throughout the year of legal drama around Trump. And when that happens, our poll is suggesting there is a rally around Trump effect that takes place among Republican primary voters. And that could end up, I don't know what that'll do for him in the general election, but that could be something that helps him throughout 2023 as the Republican primary takes shape.
Yeah, and that is the question. Will there, in fact, be more indictments, more legal challenges? Thank you for that, Steve Kornacki, Monica Alba. Really appreciate it. Joining me now to discuss all of this, Eugene Scott, senior politics reporter at Axios. Symone Sanders-Townsend, former senior advisor to Vice President Harris. She's also, of course, the host of Symone on MSNBC. And Stephen Hayes, editor and CEO of The Dispatch and an NBC News contributor. Thanks to all of you for being here on a busy Monday. Eugene, I want to start with you and this lack of enthusiasm for both of the potential candidates in the general election. How do these potential campaigns counter that? And does turnout become, I mean, we always talk about turnout, but is that now really the focus?
Absolutely. And we have to remember in 2020, there was some early lack of enthusiasm for these candidates. And I think what we've seen both of the candidates do then was make their voters turn out. They've put forward ideas and convictions and policies and promises that made people who initially said, you know what, I'm not crazy about this, ultimately do what they needed to do when Election Day came around.
Stephen, what's your take on this? I mean, only 5% want to see President Biden and former President Trump run again. That's staggeringly low. I mean, what are the implications of that?
In my view, that suggests the American people have a tremendous amount of common sense. I mean, they weren't enthusiastic about these choices in 2020. Even as Eugene says, they eventually rallied to the side. But that, I think, is an effect of negative partisanship, not of enthusiasm for the candidates. You know, in your discussion with Monica and Steve, you called it stunning. I think it is absolutely stunning when you look at these numbers. When you look at the Joe Biden numbers in particular, we all know that there's a strong group of Republicans, independents, and Democrats who are opposed to Donald Trump. But the Joe Biden numbers in particular are stunning because he's the sitting president. He's the incumbent. He has this huge advantage built in. And Monica told you that she thinks the White House strategy is going to be to say, well, watch him. I would just say we'd like to watch him. We actually don't see that much of him. He's not doing press conferences. He's not giving a lot of interviews. He's not out there. And if he runs, he's going to have to be on the campaign trail. I would suggest to you that the White House might not be as confident in private when they tell us to watch him as they are in public when they give comments like that.
Symone, what about that? And does the president, the administration, his campaign need to make him more available on the campaign trail?
Look, I think that it is retail politics that wins campaigns, and retail politics is being out there with the people. That's where we hit a lot of diners, the coffee shops, you know, what we were all used to prior to, you know, COVID-19 and the pandemic hitting us. And frankly, retail politics is where Joe Biden shines. And so I do think that the president himself is going to want more face time with people, with individuals. But this is going to be very different than 2020, right? This is, first of all, he is the sitting president of the United States of America, which means, yes, he wants to go out there and campaign, but he's got a trip to Ireland coming up. He will be making more international trips. And increasingly, it is hard to make the case domestically while you are out about in the world doing the business of the presidency. So I think there'll be a balance and a rope that they have to walk, but it is going to be absolutely critical that the president is out there with the people, speaking with folks, not behind a podium on prompter.
And I think we have a word cloud of voters' concerns about President Biden running again, and it really kind of underscores some of the points that you're making here, Symone, that voters are concerned about the issue of age at 80 years old. Eugene, he obviously is the oldest president here. Age, too old, younger. The White House, the president's emerging campaign knows that they have to address this. But you heard Monica talk a little bit about strategy, but how do they do this in an effective way? Because to some extent it is what it is.
It is what it is. And I think to a lesser degree, some of these issues were concerns in 2020. And what the White House did at the time when he was a candidate was convince voters that he had the most experience. And this was going to show up as wisdom, and especially compared to, opponent who did not have this type of institutional wisdom and experience and discipline. And so I think they're going to lean in on that. They're also likely going to get younger surrogates. We saw the Instagram influencers come on board. I was talking to some people with Maxwell Frost's team. There really is going to be an effort, I believe, to try to get some surrogates who can convince people that he has what's best.
It's interesting because Biden is just a little bit more liked by voters, Stephen, than former President Trump. Is that significant given how far out we are from 2024?
I mean, it matters. Likability matters in a general election. That's no secret. But if you look at the splits among Republican enthusiasm for Trump and Democratic enthusiasm for Biden, Republicans are more enthusiastic about Donald Trump at this point. Now, that befuddles me, but there are a lot of Republicans who do like Donald Trump. And as Steve pointed out, he goes through these legal battles and these legal moments, and there seems to be this rallying around around Trump effect. I will say, what we saw in the Manhattan DA, may well be very different from his role in the insurrection, his role in trying to steal an election, where I think voters, Republican voters in particular, will be reminded of some of the things that have given them the most pause about Donald Trump, rather than this sort of triple bank shot case that we're seeing out of New York.
Yeah, and as Steve said, the big X factor here are the legal issues swirling around the former president. Will there be more indictments?
More indictments, and will those indictments push voters, not the Republican Party apparatus as a whole, but will it push the voters to say, maybe Donald Trump has too much baggage for us. Maybe I want to go with another candidate. We don't know. Again, end of August is the first debate on the Republican primary side, so we have to wait and see. I would say this about the enthusiasm or the lack thereof for either of the candidates. I think what matters, the follow-up here, I think is very important. If candidate X or candidate A, if Joe Biden or Trump are on the ballot, will you vote for them? And I think that Democrats increasingly say, we think Joe Biden is too old, but oh yeah, if it's him or Donald Trump, I'm voting for Joe Biden. So I don't know.
By that argument?
I mean, yeah, I can see that. I think Republicans are nervous about going head-to-head with Donald Trump against Joe Biden. Clearly, even with the country expressing what we've seen in this poll, I think Republicans are nervous.
Let's talk about Republicans writ large in the emerging field. And Trump is leading DeSantis by double digits. Again, it's still so incredibly early, but Eugene, what do you make of this? And Simone's talking about the first debate. I mean, do the knives need to come out at that debate so that a Ron DeSantis, a Mike Pence, who is not yet officially announced, can actually start carving out their own lane?
It's going to have to be. I mean, this has been Trump's party for a while, and the people who've entered into the race right now have not been very critical of the president. They're trying to figure out a way to run alongside him without, attacking him so they don't alienate voters, but show that they're somehow different from him, but have the same worldview as him. It's really confusing, and people know Trump in the GOP, and they said, that's what I like. I don't know what you're doing, and that's why they're backing him. It'll be interesting to see what Chris Christie does, who is trying to carve a lane at someone who will run while criticizing Trump.
Yeah, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder, is there room for other people that we're not polling, other people that we're not spending a lot of time talking about getting? Glenn Youngkin just got a major contribution from a donor who had given to Ron DeSantis and had previously been a Donald Trump supporter. You hear talk about Brian Kemp, who seems, at least among Republican primary voters I talked to have handled the Trump situation pretty well, come out ahead. And I think as Ron DeSantis looks weaker than people would have expected him, he's not the only Trump alternative. Do you start to see other people who have thought maybe they wouldn't run say, I might take my shot?
Symone, is this a moment where we see abortion becoming for as large of an issue as it is, does it become the central theme for the president? And does he, what he did in 2022 effective? Does he need to build on that?
I think absolutely. Abortion is, in fact, a 2024 issue for Democrats and Republicans, because when rights are rolled back, when the bans come in place across the country, it's not just bans for women who voted for Joe Biden. It is the ban, period, blanket ban, and it affects Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And I do think that while Republicans have to get their good answer on every candidate has to figure out where they stand and just lean into wherever that is, just pick a place and plant your feet. I think Democrats concurrently, when and if he announces his reelection campaign, he will also have to come out strong on it. I think his administration has a record, but I do think that there are folks among the base that want to hear more from the president, and I think that he is poised and ready to give them what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, Republicans, it's been interesting to watch Republicans struggle with this issue, because for 50 years they've been arguing that it should be returned to politics and that it should go to the state level. You would think that pro-life elected Republicans would have had a better answer when that's in fact what happened. But as Symone says, they're trying to figure out where they land on this. They're worried about primary fights from the right, and they're worried about a general election challenge in the main.
And notably, actually, former Vice President Pence took a swipe at his former boss for saying this is a state's issue and not being firmer on that point. Thank you so much for a great conversation, Eugene, Symone, and Stephen. And coming up, taking it to the limit, can Speaker McCarthy get his raucous caucus in line on a plan to raise the debt limit as he tries to ramp up pressure on the White House? We're live on Capitol Hill. Plus, what's next in the fight over abortion, what we were just talking about, after the Supreme Court said a widely used abortion pill will remain available as the legal battle over access to the medication moves forward. That's ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. It's the start of a consequential week for House Republicans as the U.S. faces a looming economic crisis over raising the country's borrowing limit. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is hoping to hold a vote in the coming days on his plan to raise the debt limit while cutting spending. McCarthy unveiled his plan last week to raise the debt limit by $1.5 trillion or through the end of next March in exchange for, among other things, capping budget growth at 1% per year, clawing back unspent COVID money, stripping funding for tens of thousands of IRS employees, and imposing new work requirements for government aid. The White House is vehemently opposed to the plan. They want the debt limit raised without preconditions. McCarthy is hoping to ramp up pressure on the White House to come to the negotiating table on this issue, but he won't have much leverage if he can't get his caucus on the same page first. NBC News senior Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Hakes joins me now with all of this. So, Garrett, what is the timing of a potential vote on McCarthy's plan?
Well, Kristen, the bill is expected to go through the Rules Committee tomorrow night when the House is back in session. That means the earliest we could see it on the floor is Wednesday. The House is in until Friday this week, so McCarthy's given himself basically a few days of a grace period here to make sure he's got the votes he needs. Remember, 5-seat majority, which means he can afford to lose 4. That number can rise or fall depending on absences and so forth. But the bottom line here is it's a very narrow margin. He's got to have basically everyone on board by the time they take this thing to the floor. A defeat on the floor would be almost more damaging than the political benefit he'd get just by passing a bill that, as you correctly point out in the intro, is basically his ante into getting into the White House with Joe Biden to start negotiating.
Well, Garrett, you talk about the stakes, and I guess the question is, take us inside what Speaker McCarthy is thinking and feeling right now. How confident is he heading into this week?
Look, Kristen, we knew this was going to be an issue back in January when McCarthy won the Speaker's gavel, that this debt limit fight was coming, that the majority of members of the Republican conference haven't voted for a clean debt limit hike, at least not one when Joe Biden was president. They don't want to vote for these kinds of measures, but they're going to be stuck holding the bag here, and they've got to prove they can pass something. And so what they've got is basically a conservative Christmas tree. I mean, there's a lot in this bill for the far-right members to like. If McCarthy can't get this through, I think you'll start to see questions about his leadership once again, the idea of whether he is the man to corral this conference. But I think the challenge there will be the same as it was back in January, if not him, who? With margins this thin and a conference this divided with, kind of like the moderates from New York State State, who put the Republicans in the majority on one end and the Freedom Caucus folks and the sort of more MAGA folks like a Matt Gaetz on the other end who want to make a bill like this even more conservative. It just may not be possible to keep all the cats in the wheelbarrow here, you know, and whether you're Kevin McCarthy or anybody else. But make no mistake, if he can't do it this week, those questions will start up again.
Well, you always have a way of putting things, Garrett. Let me ask you bluntly, I mean, could his speakership be in jeopardy if he doesn't get this vote through? And just kind of remind folks of how easy it is to challenge him.
Well, it's very easy to challenge him. Only one member can call for basically a no confidence vote in McCarthy. That was one of the concessions he made beginning this process. I think there will be questions if he can't get the vote through this week, but I don't know that this would be the end of the road if he can't get it through this week. And the reason I say that is because the bill that he's putting on the floor is quite popular with the most conservative members. They're probably the ones who'd be most likely to challenge him. The moderate members, we use that term, are just moderate politically. In many cases, they're more moderate sort of stylistically in how they view the House. If you're a Mike Lawler or a D'Esposito or one of these other new members from New York State or Nancy Mace from South Carolina, it's not in your best interest to throw McCarthy over the side because whoever comes after him is likely to be more conservative. So while I think that you could have the crows circling if he has a problem this week, the mess that a McCarthy-less Republican House would be in would be deeper than the mess that with him at the helm would be. So I think it's not like he's going to not survive this week if the vote doesn't go through, but the questions will start.
Fantastic context and reporting, as always. Garrett Haake, thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thanks, Chris.
Coming up next, voters weigh in on the issue of abortion as the legal case over limiting access to one of the most widely used abortion methods moves forward. The latest legal and political developments next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. We've got new NBC polling on the issue of abortion amid the intensifying legal battle over access to a common abortion drug. According to our new poll, nearly 6 in 10 adults say abortion should be legal always or most of the time. 38% say it should be always or mostly illegal. That's essentially unchanged since last May. Now, these new numbers come as the Supreme Court temporarily preserved access to the abortion pill mifepristone. Late Friday, the High Court granted the Department of Justice a stay, pausing a decision by a federal judge in Texas that would have taken the pill completely off the market. Joining me now is NBC Washington correspondent Yamiche Alcindor to discuss all of this. So, Yamiche, bring us up to speed here. Obviously, we had that ruling Friday night. What are you watching for next?
One, I think we almost have to continue to underscore that this means that this pill, mifepristone, is as accessible as it was before this case began. Women can still get it if they want to get it by mail. They can get a generic version. They can also use it now up to 10 weeks of pregnancy. All of that happens, but the Supreme Court did issue this stay, which means it goes back to the lower court, which is the Fifth Circuit of Appeals. But legal experts say it's going to end up likely back at the Supreme Court, which is sort of head-spinning because whoever loses at the appeals court, whenever they have oral arguments in May, is likely going to appeal to the Supreme Court. So what I'm watching out for is what are these oral arguments going to be? What is it going to sound like? What is it going to look like? And then what are these judges, whatever the ruling is, what is their thinking as they go back to the Supreme Court?
And, Yamiche, I guess the question is, when you look at the polling, just big picture, it's very consistent with the polling that we saw over Dobbs, which is that a majority of Americans support abortion remaining legal. What are the implications of that? Obviously, you and you're covering the legal aspects of all of this, but the politics, too.
There's a lot of politics to this. Think about it, the fact that there's this huge public opinion, something like 60% of Americans saying, I want some sort of access to abortion, and I think that it should be legal in some way. But the courts continuing in some ways to say that's not going to be the case, while ballot referendums, you think of ruby red Kansas or blue states in Maryland and other places, they're all voting for measures that continue to protect abortion access. But it really just shows you that there's really a conflict between the courts and public opinion. And I want to pull out one other number from the polling that I pulled that really stuck out to me, and it's 43% of Americans say abortion is extremely important to them, and the overwhelming majority of people who are saying that abortion is extremely important to them are Democrats, which means that this is going to be a continually issue that Democrats are going to galvanize around. They're going to mobilize around. So whenever President Biden says he's running for re-election, which we might think might be this week, we think that this is going to be, reporters and myself think this is absolutely going to be something that is going to be a key issue that is going to make Democrats want to go to the polls.
Yeah, really great reporting, Yamiche. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Set us up very well for our next conversation, which is with Katie Daniel, State Policy Director for SBA, a Pro-Life America. Thank you so much, Katie, for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to get your reaction to our new poll numbers off the bat. 58% of Americans say they believe abortion should remain legal. 38% said they believe it should be illegal. The overwhelming majority of those who say it should be illegal say there should be exceptions. Just give me your reaction to these numbers.
Well, when we look at any poll, we really need to dig into the specifics. We've been polling on the current FDA policies. 75% of Americans say the FDA should have tested these drugs on minors. They should have done research on the difference between minors and adult women. They didn't. Over 60% of Americans say that these drugs should not be sent through the mail. So when you ask a broad question, you're going to get a broad answer. What we really need to be doing is digging into specifics. And I know we've polled various states and shown over 60% of Americans support a heartbeat law. So they would many of them would call themselves pro-choice, but they would support a pretty significant protection.
Katie, and I want to get to the mifepristone ruling in just 1 minute, but the question before these voters was about abortion writ large, and you have 58% of Americans, nearly 60%, saying they believe that abortion should remain legal. On its face, when you look at this poll, and this is not about mifepristone, this is about abortion writ large, what do you say to that? And do you worry that you are not in line with most Americans?
I think we need a lot more information. We need to understand what limits, what protections they support. If you ask people about 15 weeks, you get around 70% of Americans, including many, many pro-choice Americans who say, I support 15 weeks. We can get over 60% in many states on heartbeat. So when you break it down by what people actually support, they are much closer to the pro-life position than to the Democratic Party platform, which is abortion on demand with no limits at any time in pregnancy. But Americans don't support that.
Well, Katie, let me look. Among people who say abortion should be illegal, but with exceptions, let me read you some of these numbers. 91% of those people said that the life of the mother should be an exception. 88% said rape should be an exception. And 86% said incest should be an exception. Do you believe some states have gone too far in removing those exceptions?
Well, the great news is every single state protects the life of the mother. There is no state's law that does not protect that. And the pro-life movement has been repeatedly and consistently on the record saying that we support laws that protect the life of the mother. So we can all agree on that.
But Katie, there are about a dozen states that have a total ban on abortion. It includes Idaho, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri that don't have exception for rape, don't have exceptions for incest. I mean, what say you about that? Does that go too far?
Well, we think that states should be as protective as possible. Of course, those are heartbreaking situations, but the humanity and the dignity of the child in that situation doesn't change. We need to be supporting women, protecting them. We need to be prosecuting men who commit violent crimes. That's where our focus is. It's on supporting women, helping them become parents or adopt whatever their plan is, but not punishing the child for the father's crimes.
But just to put a fine point on it, you don't think those states that don't have exceptions for things like rape and incest have gone too far?
These states have heard from their voters. They have discussed this in hearings. One of the great things about the Dobbs decision is it brought the public back into the conversation rather than keeping this all behind a wall of the Supreme Court. So these are laws that have been passed with public support, with ongoing public conversation. And we think it's great that states are able to protect children from conception and are going to continue to do what we can to support women as well.
Now, I do want to get your reaction to mifepristone and the ruling. Just to be very clear, your organization, obviously, as you just laid out, you think there should be more research. This was approved 20 years ago by the FDA. Yes, it is used for abortion, but it's used for a range of other medical purposes as well. I guess the question is the issue here for you access to the drug altogether, or that the drug be allowed to be sold over state lines?
Our issue is that the FDA's decision to bring these drugs to market was political, and it was fundamentally flawed. They didn't do the research they needed to do. They certainly haven't done it since. And so far, 2 courts have agreed with that assessment. So our issue is that there is a federal agency whose job is to determine safety and efficacy of medications that it brings to market, and it didn't do that in this case.
The FDA would argue that they did do that, and this is a drug that has been used for 20 years. And has been proven to be safe and effective. And there are a number of medical organizations that would bolster that as well. Let me ask you about this, though. Your organization had a pretty strong response to former President Trump's comments last week when he said the decision of abortion should be left up to the states. If Mr. Trump wins the nomination, and as you know, he has said that he is a pro-life candidate, would you then support him, or would you not be able to support him because of his stance that abortion should be left up to the states?
Well, he's had some clarifying comments over the weekend, but we've been very clear that we're going to support a pro-life candidate who supports a federal minimum standard of 15 weeks or more protective. That's in line with where the American people are at. And we encourage him to run on his record. In many ways, he was the most pro-life president we've ever had. And so he should really lean into that and go run on the policies that he supported as president the first time. But, we're going to be evaluating every single candidate on the same playing field and waiting to hear what their pro-life vision is in a post-Dobbs world.
So very, very quickly, I don't hear an answer there. If he doesn't wholeheartedly embrace a 15-week ban, it sounds like you're withholding your support at this point.
We're going to hear from every candidate, and we're going to decide who has the best pro-life vision. And if that is President Trump, then that's great. And if that's somebody else, then, we encourage him to listen to the others and to run on his record and continue to run as the pro-life champion that he was in 2016 and that he was through his presidency.
All right. Katie Daniel, thank you so much for joining us with your perspective today. We really appreciate it. After the break, what's next for the crisis in Sudan and the dozens of Americans trying to get out after the U.S. evacuated its embassy over the weekend? You're watching Meet the Press now.
A decision to suspend operations at the embassy, remove our personnel from their assigned posts, is among the most difficult that any secretary has to make. But my first priority is the safety of our people, and I determined that the deteriorating security conditions in Khartoum posed an unacceptable risk to keeping our team there at this time.
Welcome back. That was Secretary of State Antony Blinken this morning following the evacuation of U.S. Embassy personnel from Sudan. And moments ago, Secretary Blinken announced in a statement that the rival military groups have agreed to implement a 72-hour nationwide ceasefire beginning at midnight. That, of course, comes after the failed ceasefire that was supposed to start a few days ago. Over the weekend, amid a deteriorating security situation on the ground, the U.S. and dozens of other countries began evacuating embassy staff and their families from the capital. The Biden administration says U.S. special forces that took off from Djibouti were able to evacuate about 80 people from the American embassy. In a statement, President Biden called the operation a success, thanking Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Saudi Arabia for assistance. But despite all of this, approximately 16,000 Americans, some dual citizens, still remain in Sudan as the two military factions continue to fight for control. Joining me now is NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kube. So, Courtney, a lot of moving parts right now. There are still Americans in Sudan. What's the latest?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the estimates are somewhere in the neighborhood of about 16,000 Americans. The question is, how many of those actually want to leave or are trying to leave? And those numbers are a little bit tougher to come by. Most officials we speak to say it's probably in the hundreds who may want to evacuate. But at this point, there is no real plan to actually do a larger scale evacuation of all the Americans there in Sudan. Now, that being said, the military is always planning, so they have the capability there in the region to do it. They just have not been ordered to do so. And I have to say, according to a number of officials that we've been speaking to all weekend long, at this point, the Biden administration is leaning in the exact opposite direction of any real large scale evacuation, but beyond what we've already seen. Now, that being said, the evacuation of the U.S. government personnel over the weekend went off without a hitch. Since then, a number of other nations have come to the U.S. and asked for help to help evacuate their government personnel. And U.S. officials tell me that there is there's a possibility that the U.S. may help some other nations. We've seen a little bit of that today with this escorting a UN convoy to Port Sudan.
So, Courtney, let me ask you, because we just talked about this ceasefire that's set to go into effect at midnight that Secretary Blinken talked about. How much confidence is there in this ceasefire? You've obviously covered all sorts of conflicts, and they can be quite tenuous, to say the least.
Yeah, and unfortunately, with this specific situation, there have been a number of ceasefires, and none of them have held. I mean, they haven't even lasted a matter of hours. So I think there's always a little bit of hopefulness at the beginning when one is declared, especially in the case of the one that Secretary Blinken just announced, and in the case of the one that was supposed to be 72 hours over the weekend to celebrate the end of Ramadan. In both cases, both sides actually came out and said they had agreed to it. Unfortunately, neither of them is held. Again, there is a hope. The reality is, even if there is some sort of a ceasefire, it's not even so much about both sides stopping with the firing and the clashing. It's about them then, each side believes the other needs to also retreat back. And neither is doing that. And that's what keeps being and that seems to be the catalyst for the fighting to begin again.
Courtney Kube, thank you so much. Really appreciate your great reporting. I know you'll continue to watch this situation. I now want to bring in Susan Stigant, Director of the Africa Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Susan, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Let me just have you respond to this ceasefire. How optimistic are you? What are your key concerns here?
Well, I think it's encouraging that there's a move to try to silence the guns. We're seeing a pretty horrendous humanitarian situation develop in Khartoum at the moment and other parts of the country where the fighting's taking place. But I think people are nervous. As you talked about, there have been numerous attempts already. So there's, I think, hope. But it will be important to get very concrete about what the cessation of hostilities looks like. So in concrete terms, who needs to stop fighting? Where do lines need to be drawn? Where do people need to be pulling back? And to ensure that it's being communicated to those who are on the front lines as well.
And you were just there. You were just in Sudan. What did you see? What were your key takeaways?
I was there about 2 weeks ago, and there was a lot of tension at the time. It was at the point where the political dialogue was getting to some of the hardest issues about the integration of the forces, the command structure, and who would be in charge. And already there was deployment of some of the rapid support forces into Khartoum and an increase of those forces, as well as deployment of heavy tanks and machinery. And so there were signs that things were tense. I think everybody believed that they would posture and step back.
And that didn't happen. This is now a country that many believe could be on the brink of a civil war. What needs to happen to prevent that from happening?
I mean, I think the first step is to get an end of the fighting immediately to allow for the humanitarian access. I mean, people have been stuck in urban centers since the fighting started 8 days ago without food, without water, without electricity. And we're seeing a mass exodus of people. 60,000 people arrived into Port Sudan on the east coast today. People are fleeing to Egypt. People are starting to flee across the border to Ethiopia. And so that really needs to be the first order priority.
Is there a country you think that could best serve as mediator in this instance?
I think it's going to take a collaboration across various countries. The United States is an important partner. The countries in the region have stepped forward and said that they wish to mediate and want to see an end to the violence. Countries in the Gulf have significant influence over the respective parties. It's going to take a coherent push by all of those.
Obviously, there was the evacuation of embassy staff, but there are still Americans who are in Sudan. How much concern do you have for their safety and their security?
I have a deep concern for the Americans, a deep concern for the Sudanese as well. I think I talk to people who are making some of the hardest decisions of their lives about whether to stay in their homes or whether to flee, whether to move when there's quiet or stay and hope that a ceasefire will actually hold. And imagining what could be the repercussions if the violence continues.
Sudan really relies heavily on aid organizations that are not able to access and fulfill their normal duties that they would be. How is that impacting this already dire humanitarian situation there?
Yeah, I think that's one of the main concerns is in the moment where you have a major crisis and it seems that people are pulling back, there needs to be a push to get assistance into the areas where civilians are fleeing. I will say there is a tremendous capacity, and we see communities that are organizing with great generosity to move water to people who need it, to help people along the way as they're evacuating out, to really protect their own communities. And I think that's the foundation that we saw in Sudan's peaceful revolution in 2019. That's the hope for what the country will be in the future.
How do you assess the job that President Biden and the Biden administration's response so far? Have they been reactive enough? What would your message be to them?
Well, I think that we should be taking this with the greatest degree of seriousness. And so having President Biden involved, talking regularly to leaders across the world, messaging the importance of playing a helpful role, but also making sure that nobody is fueling the conflict by providing resources to any of those who are fighting, and then holding the space for the civilians. Civilians are caught up in the fighting right now, but they have to be part of the solution going ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your perspective. We really appreciate it. Susan Stigant, really appreciate all of your information. Still to come, thirsting for violence and organizing for action. That's how the Justice Department described the actions of 5 Proud Boys on trial for seditious conspiracy. We're live outside the D.C. courthouse, where closing arguments are now officially underway. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The trial of 5 Proud Boys leaders charged with seditious conspiracy in connection with the attack on the Capitol is winding down. Jurors heard closing arguments today in the trial of Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio and 4 of his associates. Prosecutors told the jury the defendants were thirsting for violence leading up to January 6th and that the Proud Boys saw themselves as fighting force for then President Trump. Joining me now to discuss this from outside the district courthouse is NBC News Justice reporter Ryan Riley. Ryan, thank you so much for joining me. I understand there's an ice cream truck behind you, so that is the noise that we hear. We'll just get that off the table. Talk to me about these closing arguments. What was the centerpiece, the crux of the government's closing argument today?
You know, the government came in pretty strong, and they have a lot of evidence against these defendants. Of course, you know, some of the defendants, 2 of them testified and admitted at least some of their conduct. Dominic Prezzola is the individual who's in that infamous video holding a stolen police shield, using it to smash open the window of the Capitol during that first breach. And of course, he had to kind of admit that. It's on video, not much arguing there, and apologize for his actions. But when he was on the stand, you know, last week, he was talking about this idea that there wasn't this plan ahead of time for storming the Capitol. And, you know, prosecutors really haven't shown much evidence in terms of a specific plan about we're actually going to invade the Capitol. There is some talk about, you know, occupying Capitol buildings in one document. It wasn't clear if all the defendants actually saw that. But more what prosecutors have argued is that this really came together in those final moments, and that even if the conspiracy really formed as soon as the initial breach of those Capitol barriers took place, that's still a conspiracy. You can still enter into a criminal conspiracy in those final moments. I do think one of the most stunning moments in this trial was during this testimony last week, as the government cross-examined Zachary Rehl, who's the head of the Philadelphia Proud Boys. They just at the last moment received this new evidence from online sleuths that online sleuths were able to obtain over a long weekend that showed Zachary Rehl pointing a canister of what appeared to be pepper spray at officers. And the government says that is in fact what that was. And Zachary Rehl was sort of a little bit wiggly on the stand about whether or not that was him, and said that he did not, quote, recall whether or not he pepper sprayed any officers that day, which is not the same as saying that I did not pepper spray any officers that day. So that was a last minute surprise that we saw in this trial last week.
Yeah, that's interesting, Ryan. And what was the broader closing argument that we heard from defendants?
From defendants, you know, that there essentially wasn't a plan. That's basically been their major emphasis here. They've also obviously taken some issue, you know, particularly in Zachary Rehl's case, with whether or not that video does indeed show him that day. But, you know, basically saying that there was a lot of violent rhetoric. They used a lot of this violent rhetoric. But that wasn't what they were actually planning on January 6th, and a lot of this was just tough talk. But, you know, there's this famous phrase that we heard a lot of in this trial, which is FAFO, FAFO, and then it means F around, find out. And, what we're really getting to here is the find out stage of this Proud Boys trial, because the jury is going to be getting this case very soon. And there's a lot of evidence against them. And, these defendants have already been kept in custody for 2 years. And we're going to end up finding out exactly what the jurors thought of the evidence that the government presented and whether or not the defenses that the Proud Boys presented held any water.
Ryan, very quickly, will the outcome of this trial have an impact on other January 6th trials?
Potentially, but I think the government is getting towards the end of some of the more broader cases that it had. We've already had these major cases, 3 trials against the Oath Keepers. The Proud Boys really is, for the time being at least, one of the bigger conspiracy trials that we have on the agenda. Although there are 1,000 other defendants who have been charged, and hundreds of whom have already been convicted in their individual cases.
All right, Ryan Riley, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you for being with us this hour. I'm back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson. Right.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.